So I gotta say, when I saw the poster for this event, I was like, oh man, that's a dope image. Like, what's that from? And then I was like, oh shoot, I took that picture and they posterized it and cropped it. It looks so much better. Really cool.
It is a great picture.
Where'd you take that at? I was looking at it and I was like, hey.
That's at Mauna Kea. Yeah. From like maybe like 3 years ago or 4 years ago.
Okay, I think we can get started. So hello, everyone. Welcome. We are very excited to welcome you to the last session of this year's Early Career Scientist Symposium. My name is Chatura Vaidya. I am a PhD candidate here at the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Michigan. Now, traditionally, on the last session of this symposium, we have a senior scientist give a keynote talk, followed by talks by two early career researchers. But this year, we are doing something different. Today's session is special because after our initial conversations with Dr. Nick Rio, who is our intended keynote speaker, we decided to engineer something that is more interactive and to move away from the traditional academic format. Instead, we have organized a panel discussion with our guest speakers who are all experts in studying Indigenous knowledge and conducting research, which includes partnerships with the communities where it takes place. And we have also included a group of especially interested graduate students from EEB as active panelists as active participants in the panel. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's guest panelists. Dr. Nick Rio, who is our keynote speaker, is an associate professor of Native American and Environmental Studies at Dartmouth College, where he studies Indigenous knowledge and ecological stewardship on Indigenous lands. He blends ecological, anthropological, and Indigenous methodologies in his work, often via tribal community university-wide partnerships. Dr. Robin Clark is a postdoctoral researcher at Michigan Technical University, where she also obtained her PhD in 2021. For her dissertation, she conducted collaborative research with the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians and Bay Mills Indian community, using integrated social and ecological analyses to better understand Gijik forest communities in the eastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan and to assert good Anishinaabe relations with them. Dr. Katie Kamelamela is a postdoctoral research associate at the Akaka Foundation for Tropical Forests, an organization that seeks to safeguard and preserve tropical forests in Hawaii through incorporation of Indigenous land management practices. She obtained a PhD in botany and ecology, evolution and conservation biology at the University of Hawaii, and is currently determining how historical and current knowledge can provide insight with regards to the onset and mitigation of drought in Hawaii. So could I please ask our guest panelists to tell us a little bit about your current research projects? Could we start with Dr. Nick Rio, please?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. So my name is Nick Rio, as we covered. I'm Anishinaabe from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. So our tribe's located in what's now northern Michigan. Grew up in the suburbs of Detroit and live now with my family in Vermont. And the two main things that I work on, like the sort of major themes or threads in my research, the first one is focused on Indigenous customary land and sea-based practices within contemporary contexts. So basically I work to understand and support Indigenous practices tied to hunting, fishing, plant gathering, and various forms of land care, including ecological restoration work. The second theme that I focus on is trying to unsettle colonial environmentalisms that have proven to be toxic to Indigenous peoples. So I do work to critique the environmental movement and environmental sciences for contributing to Indigenous erasure. And I guess what that's all about is that environmentalists and environmental science communities and their narratives tend to focus on climate change as like a kind of our major issue facing our planet, and the cause of climate change being greenhouse gas emissions, which is factual, but it falls short of identifying the central role that land-based colonialism and extractive forms of capitalism play as sort of more like root causes to global climate change and all the issues that are tied to it. So I work to critique those literatures in those fields. Those are the two main themes of my work right now.
Thank you. Dr. Katie Kamelamela, could you please tell us something about your research?
Yeah, I am at Akaka Foundation. Currently, I'm working with the Pacific Island Climate Adaptation Science Center, looking at Hawaii Indigenous local knowledge of drought, so connecting historical Hawaiian proverbs known as Olalono'eau with contemporary practices. So using the historical literature and then doing interviews with current resource managers who work within a Native Hawaiian framework. Different from Native Americans, Hawaiians don't have tribes or a central form of government. So it's a different bit of a challenge out in Hawaii than in the upper 48. And then also at Akaka, I work as the administrator for the Pu'uva'ava'a community-based subsistence forest area. It's the first subsistence forest area that we're proposing on state lands that focuses on Native Hawaiian practices to reforestation, inclusive of Native and non-Native plants that have been adopted and are useful for cultural and economic sustainability of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Clark?
Right, Buju Mchikiji Gukwe Indigenous. I'm speaking to you from Baoting, which is from my home at Baoting, which is where the waters of Lake Superior flow into the St. Mary's River. And there used to be these beautiful, expansive rapids here, but now we have a lock system. But so I just finished my doctorate in December, as mentioned, after spending most of my career, but most of my career working for and with the tribes in Michigan. And so right now I'm working as a postdoctoral scholar at Michigan Tech on two different projects. One is a partnership with Michigan's Department of Natural Resources, their forestry and wildlife divisions, and the U.S. Forest Service to understand how Gijik, or northern white cedar, has responded to historic silvicultural treatments, and then look at ways of potential silvicultural treatments moving forward to help honor and protect or respect these trees. And then the other project is a partnership with the Keweenaw Indian community, so one of those tribes, on an Anishinaabe knowledge governance project. So we're developing guidance for natural resource or first relations and tribal governance based on Anishinaabe and Western sciences. I'm also a mom and a partner raising my two kids here at Baoting, just to throw that in there.
Well, thank you so much, all three of you. Also, I would like to now quickly introduce the graduate students who will be participating in today's panel, starting with myself. I'm Chatura, like I said earlier, a PhD candidate here in the EEB department. I study plant-insect interactions, mostly in agricultural and urban ecosystems, and primarily focus on plants and their pollinators. Katrina, could you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Chatura. My name is Katrina Munsterman. I'm a PhD student in EB. I study social ecological systems in the Caribbean, and I'm specifically interested in how fish and human fishers, their behavior affects small-scale fisheries. And yeah, I'm happy to be here today.
Thanks. Crystal?
Hi, I'm Crystal Sanchez. I'm a fifth-year student here in EEB. My work is disease ecology in aquatic ecosystems, self-medication behavior in aquatic organisms, and delighted to be here and be part of this panel.
Thanks. Susanna?
Hi, I'm Susanna. I'm also a fifth year graduate student, and my research is focusing on how long distance movements, such as seasonal migration in birds, affects the genetics of the immune system. And I'm also thrilled to be here.
Thank you. I would like to let everyone know in the audience that as the discussion moves along, and if you have any questions for our guest speakers, please feel free to type them in the Q&A chat function of this webinar, and we would ask them for you. And with that, I would like to hand over to Katrina to kick off today's discussion.
It's me who started the first question, I think.
Sorry, Crystal.
Yeah, so I guess the first question that we wanted to ask our panelists is, in your opinion, what do you see as anti-research research in ecology and evolutionary biology?
Sorry, Crystal, could you just repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, sorry about that. In your opinion, how would you define, or what do you see as anti-research research in EEB or in ecology?
Anti-racist, I think you mean to say.
Yes, sorry.
Okay. Who wants to start?
I'll pitch. I'm just going to repeat the question to make sure I heard it correctly. What's our opinion about anti-racist research within ecology and evolutionary biology? Okay, so I think I'll go with like the nicest way to say this. Racist research is not inclusive of everybody, or separates different or challenging forms of thought from those that are more accepted from mainstream. And I think that's like a really light way to do it. And I know that Nick is ready to gun now, possibly. But really I'm gonna make it really general. It's research that aims to not do the due diligence it's supposed to, and focus on only the type of outcome that is projected to be seen. So that would mean not including different forms of methodologies, not including different forms of philosophy, not because they don't have time, but because there is no value seen in adding those ways of being and knowing. That's my light touch on that.
So the one layer to that response that I'll just add, because I agree with everything Katie just shared, is I think that anti-racist research in the sciences in general is working to break down power imbalances, as opposed to like sort of status quo science really kind of props up power imbalances and props up unhealthy power structures. And so to do that, I mean, this is more of like getting a little bit into the how instead of the what, but to do that, you have to first recognize that your work is political. And I think that that's a major obstacle to the sciences engaging in this work, is like, we're still just stuck thinking that our work is apolitical. But you know, none of it is. Yeah.
Well enough.
And I'm sorry, I think I answered the question is, what is racist research within ecology, evolutionary biology? So the anti part of that, sorry, I was trying to go for what was the black and the white. But anti-racist research in EEB is standing your ground and listening to your gut. And like, sometimes you dig in and sometimes you walk away. And the determination that I'm making at that point on whether to dig in or walk away is, how does that impact the health of my person and of my family? And I think sometimes the training in conservation, and especially within minority or marginalized or Native groups, is your relationship to the land, your responsibility to your community, the kuleana or the rights and responsibilities that you have to your immediate family that you need to like take care of. And we don't talk about that in professional development. We don't talk about like, what is that line? And I actually crossed that line this past week, and where I prioritized my work over my health. And now, if we're not alive, we can't do the work and we can't do the advocacy. And so I just want to put that out there, not just as a mental health check, but understanding who you are, where you stand, where you want to go, maybe how you get there, and when is enough enough. And only you can make that determination for yourself when doing anti-racist work in EEB.
Thank you for those answers, and thank you, Dr. Kamelamela, for doing that sort of black and white. I think that, doing both of those definitions, it's very helpful. And then to sort of follow up with that question, how much of your work is research versus advocacy, and what informs that?
I guess I could start this time. I think that that all of my research is advocacy. And the reason I say that is because I'm trying, in everything I do, I'm trying to be responsive to Indigenous priorities and to help make more space for Indigenous peoples to thrive and to chart our own paths into the future. So all of my work is kind of focused on that sort of, that broad, sort of broad vision and goal, I guess. And, there's definitely moments where I'm able to work with my own community or other Indigenous communities where it just feels like we're doing our own thing on our own terms. But most of the time it involves breaking down some kind of barriers or breaking down some kind of borders in order to be able to make space for that work. And so that's where, for me, that's where the advocacy sort of lens enters into the work.
I'll jump in. So absolutely, research is advocacy. I can't separate the two. Like the issues that we choose to learn about, how we want to learn about them, who we engage in that learning, and then how we share what we learn. There's decisions all along the way that effectively advocate for certain perspectives or understandings or obligations. And so like what informs my advocacy, like from this Anishinaabe perspective, so all nations, human and non-human, maintain their own purposes and roles and responsibilities in creation. And so it's my responsibility to watch and listen and to learn from these other beings and other nations as teachers. And so that's sort of my basis for that, both research and advocacy, although I focus on the forest nations, right, and trees, but.
Yeah, I support what Nick and Robin said. My PhD was looking at forest gathering practices, historical and contemporary, and then doing the first analysis of plant gathering permits for the state we finished that in 2017. So my work is inherently political, related to policy, being like the middleman between policy and communities, continue into my current position. And again, a recent situation happened, and I became, let's use the word, passionate, as some people may call it, because people don't understand that this work is political. Yes, I work in a nonprofit, but we're pushing policy. Yes, I'm in conservation, but our whole goal is to put Native values up front to lead our restoration. And those policies do not exist. So in order for them to exist, we need to create new policies or identify policies that we want to mirror, which honestly is the better route, so that people who are in the system don't get all surprised. It's already something that's familiar, but we're just tweaking it a little bit. And it also benefits us because we don't have to start from scratch. So it's really like you're always an ambassador. I don't know if you guys ever did, programs when you're a kid. They're like, you represent your family name. Well, as Native Hawaiians, like you represent Native Hawaiians when you go away. And so like that's how it is. And I'm not sure other people have had that type of training, like you represent a community when you go out there. So if I fly off the handle, it's not just Dr. Kamelamela flying off the handle. It's literally all Native Hawaiians who work in science flying off the handle. And everybody else will be impacted by my actions. Or I've been impacted by other people's actions who I've never met. And so the advocacy isn't just about the policy, it's about the individual social structures, which is the power balance that we're talking about, what's acceptable, what is more mainstream. So advocacy isn't just about the science, it's also about how you conduct yourselves and how you're able to communicate effectively with people that you want to get your message across to.
Thank you. So I'll ask another question. What have been some of the biggest or most memorable obstacles you've faced? And are there any particular strategies used to overcome them?
Robin, it's your turn to go first if you're up for it.
Okay, so I just finished my doctorate. So like lots of obstacles, right, are fresh in my memory. But my dissertation focused on Anishinaabe relationships with Gijik, with northern white cedar. From an Anishinaabe perspectives, but using, Western scientific analytical tools. But I had no Indigenous mentors at Michigan Tech, and I'm not aware of any Indigenous faculty. So not a super diverse faculty there. But I clearly remembered the first sort of disagreement or that I had with faculty there about my research, particularly my research being biased. So in the first chapter of my dissertation, I was writing from an Anishinaabe perspective, guided by the communities here at Baoting and Ginoje-Kaning, another tribe, or Bay Mills Indian community. And so in that chapter, asserting that Gijik, these trees, are sentient and elder beings within an Anishinaabe worldview, and to whom Anishinaabe people have obligations. So anyway, so this faculty member was like repeatedly pointing out how I was being super biased and how I needed to change that, And so I repeatedly responded with, yes, I am being biased, and I'm being very clear about what those biases are. I wasn't writing as a removed or objective researcher. I was writing as a member of the community, speaking from and with community members. So it was challenging, like within that university environment, but I was lucky enough to be in community here. And so it was those two communities who mentored me through that dissertation process, where the university could not, right? And they gave me direction and what to pursue. They showed me what they wanted and what they expected out of my research. And they cheered me in my bias. And actually some even took the lead as co-authors on a chapter, on that particularly biased chapter, including Dr. Rio here. So, but not every student can go through a program or earn a degree while living in their community. So I think it's vital that universities have Indigenous faculty and staff, and that as well as maintaining strong relationships with tribal and other communities of color. One example of many.
Robin, can I ask a follow-up? So this is from our Q&A. Could you say something more about the traditional management systems of the red cedar?
Oh, so this is white cedar, northern white cedar, the Thuya occidentalis, and traditional management systems. So I'm trying to move away from even using management or resource when we're talking about these elder beings. But so I worked with two Anishinaabe communities, or members of two Anishinaabe communities who gather from Gijik, gather foliage, gather bark, use the wood, but also Gijik is prominent in a lot of our legends. So like Gijik provides instructions on how to live a good life, like from the get-go, just by existing. So I don't know how far in depth to go with the management, but in terms of forest relations with Gijik, there's a lot of nuance and, practical, physical, as well as spiritual and teachings.
Great, thank you so much. That was helpful. And so, Nick or Katie, if you have any follow-ups to asking about obstacles and any ways you found solutions to them.
I think there's like this unsaid order of panelists that we all know about at this point. So it's my turn. Related to what Robin said, I think the biggest obstacle is finding like minds. We do have some faculty at the University of Hawaii where I went to who are Native Hawaiian, but it didn't really connect with them because they didn't do the research I was in. And so similarly, my community came from my community, and I wasn't actually part of that community. I was invited into that Hawaiian community because of the science that I did. So it's a little different. Like I wasn't part of that side of the island or anything, but it wasn't so much an obstacle for me, but I would say for a lot of my colleagues, finding mentorship, like good mentorship, was probably the hardest thing to find. And honestly, I think it's the biggest piece in grad school and moving forward. The mentors that I have recruited for my postdoc, I knew couldn't really add anything to my research, but there are other things in science than research that you also want to learn about. And that's why I have those advisors now. I still have my old PhD advisor who helps me out, and I've been with her almost 18 years now. So I'm talking about like solid relationships that you can really lean on when you feel like you're the only guy on the court thinking that thought. If you feel like the man out, you really need somebody in your corner to let you know, like, yeah, you're on point, or, maybe you need to consider this. That's also part of good mentorship, is being constructive in the criticism and not just writing like questions as your edits to your paper, but providing language or giving you a leg up because you're asking a question because you need help. So identifying people who you can ask questions to and they actually answer your question, they just don't give you more questions, is really valuable moving forward. And especially when you get to these more high contentious areas. And when I mean high contentious, I mean people having a mirror in front of themselves and are being asked to accept what's there and them not being ready. And that goes back to you because you're holding up that mirror. So patience is part of that obstacle game. Knowing your purpose is also part of that obstacle game. And again, being clear about knowing who you are and probably that's like my theme. It's so critical because people push you or try and influence you But again, you have to listen to your gut and know why. So that's my answer. Thank you.
I'll just add just kind of three quick sort of categorical obstacles, things that I think have just I've had to kind of figure out how to navigate in this career path. And then I won't go into a ton of depth, but we can follow up if people have follow-up questions. And then spoiler alert, the answer or the ways to navigate most of these obstacles are what Katie said. I think that those were the tools that you need, and especially like, being comfortable with who you are, knowing yourself and being honest about that. But the main sort of types of obstacles that I run into, one is the inability of colleagues and collaborators, particularly in the sciences, to be able to practice what Mi'kmaq community members have articulated through the phrase of two-eyed seeing. So being able to kind of at the same time hold in your head and in your heart at the same time your understanding of the world and someone else's, if they're different. So there's lots of ways that plays out, but it's funny that to me and frustrating that ecology is like considered the most holistic and sort of open of the sciences, but in my interaction with ecologists and getting an ecology degree and then kind of wanting to really be a part of that community, but then now not as much, that all comes down to really, just a lot of people working with blinders on, not willing to work to try to even understand my perspective or the perspective of, the community members where we're working about things like human-animal relations or proper protocols within certain territories for spending time in a place. So that's one. And then another is basically funders of research. The things that people want to invest in terms of research, it doesn't align with the things I think about. And when I try to be just honest and brave and say, hey, this is what, this is a cool program, this is what I would do with the money, and I think it would have these outcomes or these impacts, it just doesn't line up enough. It doesn't line up with any of the kind of major funding sources, even many minor funding sources. And so, so then what is that? So where does that leave you as a researcher? I found that I had to do one of two things, and I started with one and then moved on to the other. So the one thing that I did is just sort of chase money, so figure out how to kind of do the work I want to do, but have it be intelligible to funders and other scientists enough that people would invest in the work. But I was chasing money, basically. I ended up doing things that I just didn't really believe in order to keep producing papers and things, because that's what we do for a living. Like, that's how we continue to do what we do for a living. The other strategy is to just to say, heck with it, and not worry about the money and just figure out how to do work cheaply. And so basically now, and this is, I'll share this, and I know this is a recorded panel and it's on YouTube, and this could, I don't know if it could get me fired, but it could definitely restrict my career opportunities moving forward. But like, I don't worry too much about writing grants anymore, because it's at least in the US context, it's a money chasing game for me that causes me to work in ways that are counter to what my values and what I'm passionate about and what I think I can do best. So I fund my own field work. We get, academics get paid, mostly we get paid 9 months a year anyways. And we pretend like, we don't work our asses off all summer, but we do. And so I just take that time, and I don't worry about being accountable to everybody back at the university, but I'm doing my work and I'm just paying for it, out of pocket, or, whatever, sleep on a couch, whatever it takes. So those are two major things. And then I think the other is just our, I don't know, the whole sort of career path from undergrad into grad school into, if you need, you know, if your career requires a postdoc, into tenure track job, into getting tenure, that whole system, I think it needs to be kind of reconfigured. That whole system is an obstacle. And it's far too hierarchical for like my way of thinking and the way my heart works. My whole career, I mean, I'm almost 50 years old, and I still, to this day, most people I interact with on campus, I feel like they're talking down to me. You know, I mean, I have tenure at a, you know, highfalutin Ivy League campus, and I still don't feel like I really am seen as an equal by many people that I interact with. You know, in Robin and I's community, like, we respect elders, but elders don't talk down to us. You know, like, elders don't talk down to youth. They try to see eye to eye with youth. And I've never experienced that really in academia too much. Usually it's being made to feel junior to somebody, no matter what your status is, you know? So is that an obstacle? It's not an obstacle. It's just kind of deteriorating, you know? It's an obstacle to wanting to stick with the work, I guess. Yeah.
So I have a follow-up question to that, Nick, and other panelists, if you don't mind. Do you know of any sources of funds that are available for doing explicitly anti-racist work, especially within ecology and evolutionary biology?
I don't have any leads. I really don't. If I did, I would let you know. I think that if you're doing anti-racist work, what you need to try to reconfigure your understanding of finances in a way. And so, you know, it's like, what can you give to that effort? It's not like, how can we find somebody to help us pay to do it? I mean, funding's great, don't get me wrong. And you know, maybe it's, I can give some examples. When you move outside of like strict sort of research funding, but you do work like, I don't know, you could work on like a documentary film, right? And it could be very much anti-racist EEB type work, could be the overall impact you're going for, but you're getting the funding you're getting is to make a film. So like, I think more in like the arts, you find openness to funding these kind of efforts. And there's certainly nonprofits that are investing in this kind of work, although they're oftentimes not articulating it as scientific research funding. And so you just might have to get creative about how you search for funds and be much more broad in your thinking. And I think part of it too is just that reorientation of, all right, I'm going to do this work regardless of the funding. You know, like, I'm in this for the work, and we're gonna have to figure out how to make it happen, either without the money or get creative about the money.
And I also need to put in there, sometimes you get the money that supports your work, and other people will, what's the best way to put this? Diverge that money so that it benefits their goals, even if you wrote the grant and it's your project. Something I'm going through right now. So related to what Nick said, because of my PhD, looking at culture and economic values of forest gathered plants, I started getting really into my finances. So if you guys don't know how much money you can save each month, you're really doing yourself a disservice. If you don't know how much credit card debt or student loan debt you have, and you think you're going to graduate and get a job, you're really doing yourself a disservice. So before you start looking outside for money, you need to look inside and look at what your bank account has, what you got, what don't you have, what are your financial goals? And that's actually going to help target you to where you want to be. If I'm going to be super honest, everyone should be entrepreneurs that's on this call. Everybody should have, and probably does. I don't know any college student who has never done a side gig. If you have done a side gig at any point of your career and you think it's going to change when you graduate, spoiler alert, it doesn't. It doesn't get better. So use the time you have in grad school to make your side hustle pay for your research. And that's my goal now, is to get a side hustle really in finances so I can pay for my own research, because I chased the money the last couple of years, and because of that I lost myself. I ended up doing all these other projects, not what I wrote up, and now it's like report time and someone's telling me that the project's done, but I'm like, we haven't done the project. We haven't looked at the Indigenous knowledge at all. So the whole project about Indigenous knowledge is being scrapped because we've done all the work. And I'm like, no, we haven't. So what Nick is saying is very real. And what it does really is put the researcher between a rock and a hard space, between paying their rent and having credibility in your community. It's basically your reputation is what you're having to choose between. You're having to choose between your reputation and paying your rent. And those shouldn't be things that are conflicting. So I'm letting you guys know now that that's something you have to look at. Money is money, and it's only as valuable as you give it value. And it's only as valuable as you understand how it already contributes to your life. I know people who get funds and they just blow it, and then they're still doing the research project 2 years later and they have no funds to do their project. So your project budget and your personal budget seem separate, but they're actually related at some level, because that's what you have to do your work. To get super creative about it, be an entrepreneur, to work within what you have. It's the work. No matter where you go, I'm so sorry, you have to do work. It doesn't matter where you go, whether you do it by yourself, whether you get somebody else to fund it for you. Really think about that. So Captain Cook came to Hawaii, right? Probably don't know that. But anyways, that guy got paid. That guy got paid to sail across an ocean with a botanist and an artist, and someone paid them to do that. So a lot of times, probably like for 10 years, my personal mantra was, I just need one patron. And I have a patron now. But I no longer want that patron in my life because of the compromises I've had to make. And because I thought they were a good ally, but they really have a lot of internal work that they need to do. And I didn't see that because I was chasing the money. I love all the nods I'm seeing right now. So you guys understand what I'm saying. So, it's really counterintuitive. I want to go with, for especially ecologists and scientists, but think about your money first. Think about your life goals. Think about how you're going to get there. And if you want to stay in this field, map out how that's going to happen. And if that map, if you veer from the map, it's fine. But you need to give yourself a leg up and not wait for a hand to pick you up. I don't know why I just did that, Kate. I'm off.
Yeah, thank you for being such a human perspective.
I'll add just really briefly. I think partnerships, working with other folks allows you to leverage different funding opportunities and piece together projects that you might not otherwise be able to do. That's like key for my career and my success is developing strong relationships with the different tribes or entities or that I've worked with, because once you know you can trust and collaborate with these other organizations or individuals, there's a lot more incentive to try and make things work and be more flexible and creative. And then I think just doing what you love. I love talking to and learning from community members. So like all that part of my research is like on my own time, but that's an investment in me, like what you're saying, like that's my priority. So learning about these different plants or learning about these different places, it's not something that I need to be paid for because I'm getting I'm learning from it. So making sure you can do what you love, which.
Yeah, I agree. That's really valuable. Thank you all. I also wanted to ask, how have you seen your own program change over the last 5-10 years, and where do you see it going, as well as kind of the broader community?
I could start. My work has changed dramatically. You know, I've been in academia for 20 years. Been in like a tenure track type role for the last 10. And so, you know, I've been I guess a full-time researcher or research scholar for maybe like the last 12 years. And the first, you know, basically, so up until getting tenure, I was kind of doing what I felt like I was really trying to walk. I was walking this tightrope of like trying to do work that would be recognizable, that would be rewarded, that would help me get tenure, that would help build my reputation within the fields I was trying to contribute to, that sort of thing, sort of job security work, and being true to myself and being honest about who I am and being all of who I am. It's just this balancing act, and I was definitely leaning towards writing papers and doing research and things that would help me keep my job going and help me find funding and things like that, more so than what makes me healthy and whole and happy, and is like what I think I can really contribute to some of these conversations. So yeah, basically once I got tenure, I tried to kind of find more of a balance, and it became easier to find that balance. And that's really sad. You know, I mean, if you think about it, that's not like it's not a story that I'm proud of. That means that I was kind of, you know, not being my full self for all those years. And now I'm figuring out how professionally to be all of who I am with my students, with my collaborators, with my colleagues. And you know, not everybody, and I don't know that everybody necessarily even appreciates that change, to be honest. And that's okay, because I'm okay with it, and I'm being honest about who I am, and it feels much more genuine. So the work itself has changed. I've gone. I haven't totally ditched ecology. I mean, I still do participate in ecological research, usually not as like a PI that's really kind of coming up with the design and all of that, but I'll participate in ecological research. But you know, the concepts that I'm working with more are centered in Indigenous studies, and the methodologies that I use are more what you could describe as Indigenous methodologies, which is not mutually exclusive from ecological methodologies, because Indigenous methodologies are more about sort of like the ethics of research, the responsibilities that you take on in research, and it's not so much about like the techniques that you use. It's like the protocols, the cultural protocols, and the being mindful of relationships and responsibilities in your work and things like that. So my work has pivoted more towards focusing on practicing those types of methodologies and writing about them. And the other thing that's changed for me is has been, you know, maybe as I've gotten older, I've recognized that what I care about most is who I'm working with, not what we're doing. You know, I mean, I care about what I'm doing. Like I still have like passionate things that I want to work on, but like the number one thing is I want to work with cool people. Like I want to work with people that are my friends or that I want to be friends with. I want to put at the forefront of collaborative work. I mean, first of all, I like writing and working solo too. I'm learning to exercise that voice a little bit more, but mostly I work collaboratively, and you know, I just want to put like the potential of long-term loving friendships and relationships like at the forefront of our, you know, our work together as you know, something that you would be proud to write as like a specific goal of this work is that we want to strengthen our friendships. We want to build kinship bonds through our work. And we want that to be kind of maybe we want that to be a tight-knit group, or maybe we want that to be really expansive and be more of like a a really inclusive thing where we're working in community with lots of people. So that's what gets me excited. And so my work has changed a lot to figure out how to make space for that kind of work. And thankfully that objective aligns well with what I shared earlier about needing to do things differently from a funding perspective. It's a lot easier to self-fund the kind of work that I do now than the kind of work that I thought I was going to do, that I was like the path I was on, like say maybe during my PhD program, which required a lot more equipment and different things. So.
I guess I'll throw out there changes or things that I've noticed in the last 15 or so years, generally within ecology or the world more generally. I see more Indigenous and people or researchers of color who are doing the speaking, the writing, who are doing the facilitating, working from platforms that that our elders and ancestors had to really fight for. And then we see lots of new findings from Western scientific perspectives that have like long been understood in Indigenous knowledges, and like trees actively help one another out. You know, they share resources or nutrients. Soil is living, is alive. And I think that the more people understand and are humbled by these things, by these realities, from whatever perspective they're coming, I think the safer and the healthier our world will be. So that's hopeful, at least.
Yes, in the last 10 years, I feel like the work has really gained, like I started doing this work in like 2008, and there weren't many papers about traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous systems. And now it's like the cool kid in school. It's like the cool kid at the UN. It's the cool kid in policy, and everybody, oh, what's his name? Like Frank Lake is blowing up in California with Indigenous burning. And this is maybe a good problem to have, but there isn't enough of us. I'm so exhausted from the requests, publications, journalists, like, you know, they're not like barraging me, but it's enough to where it's another job to do the PR for your projects, or, you know, even doing stuff like this. So I'm starting to monitor those things. And I think that's a good change, but also to make you aware that this stuff that we're doing is, I think, the most important part of the work, because it's the only time we get to talk about the work, the intricacies of it, and there's bigger spaces like this. So I think that's the biggest change, is that now you can talk about it. You couldn't talk about it before. People would be like, oh, I don't know, it's like airy fairy, or it's like out there. And then now there's whole rooms about these conversations. Like, you know, political leaders are fronting Indigenous communities as like, you have to talk to them. And everybody below them is like, what does that mean? So the change is very rapid now. It's like the 11th hour, and we need to get the project done. And the Indigenous kids have been doing the project the whole time. And the world is like, yo, do our homework. It's like that in a nutshell. So from going to being ignored to like the kid on the center stage, is you need to know where you want to be. If you want to be at the front of the house on panels, or if you want to be in the back of the house, writing the grants, getting the funding, connecting people to do the advocacy work. There's a lot of room. There's not enough people to do the work. So come have fun with us, guys. We need as many people to do this work with the ethics involved. I think that's the biggest thing for me, is like when things aren't ethical, I get a little nuts, and I'm learning how to process to process that, because it feels so personal when those ethical lines are crossed. So I agree with Nick on that. But for me, I think the biggest change is that people are looking at us and they're paying attention and they're actually listening. Like things that people have been saying for 10 years, people are like, okay, cool, we got that. Like, what's next? And I'm like, what do you mean, what's next? We've been saying the same thing for 10 years. So now we need to go create new materials so that we can teach you other things. So it's kind of, it's a living cycle of its own, I want to say. And it's growing. It's not a trend. People have been trying to tell me that it's a trend, and I'm like, no, I've been in this long enough to know that it's not a trend. So I think that's the next step in this change, is like people accepting that it's not a trend, and then leaning into that with, when I say policy, I really mean like social norms.
Yeah, the
Thank
only
you.
thing is,
Oh,
is
sorry,
if I
go
add
ahead.
just a little something. So the only thing I was going to add is that while this kind of work is on people's radar quite a bit more, as Katie said, you know, one thing that hasn't changed for me is, from my perspective, first of all, apologies for addressing this question, focusing on like what my work is, because I thought that's what you're asking. Then I heard your response. I was like, oh, I misinterpreted, and that sounded pretty self-centered. But the overall work in this area, you know, one thing that hasn't really changed in my view is, while people are more aware, for sure, we're still, I think, stuck in this space, and this goes way back. We're stuck in this space where people find us interesting. They find our knowledge is interesting, you know. And when I have if I have like students kind of write up a little bit about why they're taking a class that I'm offering, or we do self-introductions in the beginning, they talk about their motivations a little bit for the class. When people say, well, I just think that Native people are so interesting, I make a mental note. I'm like, all right, we got more work to do with this individual. You know, there's some catch-up work that needs to happen there. And there's just a lot of that still. And you know, and so one of the ways that plays out, it's not just like a fetishization or you're so interesting type of a vibe. Some of it too is, all right, I either recognize that I need to do this because there's like a policy driver saying that I need to do it, or there's a new cultural norm saying I need to engage with these ideas. Or I have an interest in you know, bringing this into my work for whatever reason. It could be selfish. It could just be because I think I'll get a grant if I can talk about this in this work, or it could be, you know, more genuine. Like I think it's really interesting. I think it could really help. But either way, oftentimes what it boils down to is just wanting to work within your comfort zone. You know, so if you are a non-Indigenous scholar and you're trying to engage in Indigenous knowledges or TEK or whatever, that it's like cherry picking. Like what fits with my existing way of thinking? What fits within my existing research framework and methodologies? What fits as data that I can interpret, that I can understand and work with? And you know, that doesn't solve many problems, and that's not an inclusive move. That's not anti-racist. And I think a lot of that stuff is kind of a waste of time, really, to be honest. That's when I feel kind of used, you know, to kind of add to some of what Katie was saying. That's when I feel kind of more like used up, and things that I just don't make as much time for anymore, is if there's not a genuine interest in really trying to see things from multiple lenses, to try to bring different knowledge systems in an equal playing field and conversation, then I'm not as likely to get involved. Yeah.
Thank you. I think like all three of you touched on the question that I'm going to ask you next, but you know, all of you have a really strong relationships and partnerships with the communities that you work with. But I'm interested, or we are all interested to know how you built those partnerships, you know, with the communities that you work with, especially given that there has been this historic distrust of Indigenous communities towards academic institutions, right? Because Indigenous ways of knowing have not been fully valued or respected. So how did you break those barriers when you started doing research with them? And what sort of obstacles, if you did you face when you did that?
I'll go first on this one. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but personally, I've been invited to the communities that I've done work with. I've done the work of working within community for a while, and then people learning about my research. So my current administration post is because a community member was approached by an agency, was like, we have land, let's reforest it. And they're like, did you talk to Katie? And I'd never met this community member before. I'd never worked with them. And so that's the type of, I guess, PR I was doing on my work, presenting in spaces, not just for scientists, but for communities, and then other people talking about my work. How does that help you? Do good work, be true about the work that you're doing, be actually interested in the people, in the place, in the values. Don't show up empty-handed. You know, if you come empty-handed, wash some dishes, pull some weeds. Those are some really basic things that I've grown up with, but apparently it's not a common way. And so this isn't really helpful, but be the best researcher you can be. Like, blow them out of the water. Like, if you're the only person doing research in this area, you're it. So why not be the best researcher you can be? Have high ethics, have open values so people know where you stand. And I'm going to kind of tie in a little bit about that question in the chat about being fair eyes. If people are judging you by how you look, you're not walking the walk. You're talking the talk, but the talk that you talk, you need to walk it. And when you walk that talk, people will invite you in. So it's not about them. It's about you showing them that you're committed, period. And when it comes to Indigenous communities, most often than not, it means your life. Like, to be honest, it does. And it also means that you're invested in their well-being, calling them on their birthdays, consoling them when a family member passes away, showing up, literally showing up. That's the number one thing. People are like, what does that mean? I'm like, it means that you're there. It means that you're there an hour before a crew call happens so that you can help prep. It means that you're there an hour afterwards so you can help clean up. It means that you're there before the work gets done. It means that you're there after the work is finished, because there's always more work after the work is done. So that's my roundabout answer. And like, how do you get into these communities? You earn their trust, you earn their respect from a ground level. And again, you got to know who you are, what you're doing, and why you're there. I have people ask me to introduce them to communities, and I just won't do it because they don't have the right intention. They just want to extract and, profit, which is fine, but you're not telling me that's what you want to do. You're telling me that you want to help Native elders, which is not true. So be careful with your words, use them sparingly, and only talk when you need to.
Like mic drop now. Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is that there's also, at least so with the tribes that I work with, there's also an element of like the tribal government too. And so like, it's also important to take it upon yourself to like not only like the communities and their processes of approval and accountability, but also the tribal government's processes of approval and accountability, working with staff, going through council, and there are tribal institutional review boards. Like with my dissertation research, Sioux tribe was, had these different processes that researchers needed to go through So we have a data sharing agreement, and that's not just for like interview data. That's for pretty common forest inventory type data that the university or any researchers always have to keep going back to the tribe or the tribal government to get approval for using in different instances. So there's lots of layers, I think, but Katie, that was right on.
Yeah, the policy part is critical. You got to know your players. You got to know who the decision makers are. You got to know the chain of command. If anybody was ever a junior police officer or served in the army, that will serve you well, because the chain of command is critical, not just within a scientific mainframe, but also within Indigenous communities. And that hierarchy is a little bit maybe less defined in Indigenous communities. So the relationships you need to make, like you need to seek them out. When you get to the table or when you're invited to the table, you know, I was invited by the elder, but then there was a younger person there was like, well, you think that this person should be here, I will trust you. And what that tells me is, it isn't that this person doesn't like me, it's that they don't know me. And I need to make extra care and caution to get to know them as a person, what they like, for them to get to know me. And so learn how to read the room. And if you don't know how to read the room, get on YouTube and learn, because that is, most people, like, what is it? Our communication is only 20% talking. Like the rest of it is all body language. So, and body language is different in every culture. So you'll get very fluent in different ways of being and knowing.
So the only kind of thing I wanted to add layer to this is, and I am kind of repeating what Robin and Katie already shared, but maybe saying in a little bit different way. Just relationships need to come first. So put the relationships first. So what I mean by that is, if you have no relationship to a community, I really don't recommend the first thing you do, like approaching them and saying, you know, with a research proposal. There's no relationship there. The relationship's got to come first. I mean, sometimes it works, but chances are it won't. There's a good chance it won't work. If nobody knows you, you've got no pre-existing relationship, there's not trust, then the history that you mentioned, the negative history with researchers is what's going to be on people's mind, or they just might not know if it's worth their time because you don't have a reputation there. They don't know what you're capable of. And so if you're in a position where you're like, oh, I really want to work with this community, I have no relationship there, then I guess I would also ask yourself, like, well, what are your motivations for why do you want to work there? Really go, deep into your heart and try to get an answer to that question. If it's like, well, I just think they're really interesting, then I think you need to keep trying. If it's, I think I got things to contribute, I think I can help, with things that I'm pretty sure are happening there. You don't need to start with research. Like Katie said, you can start by just showing up, getting to know people and pitching in and whatever's needed. What they need might not be what you need. But if what your motivation is that you want to help or you want to pitch in, then it shouldn't matter what you need if that's really your motivation. But at the same rate, when you start relationships, well, if you have an existing relationship and then you're thinking about doing research together, this is just a related thing. It just kind of occurred to me. I think it really, really helps for everybody to articulate what they need. Okay, so because we all do need something. And so if you go into it saying, I just want to help, I just want to help. But really what's going on is you do want to help, you do want to be involved or whatever, you want to contribute, but you got to write papers. You never said that. You just said, I just want to help, I just want to contribute. I just want to be here. It's much better to be upfront and say, yeah, I just want to help. I just want to participate. I want to be involved. And for a living, I have to write papers. And there's things that we can do together. And if that can be a part of this, like then I can make more time for it because then it counts as work or whatever. But just being upfront when you start these partnerships about what your needs are, so that people can set boundaries around those needs if they need to. Or maybe they open it wider and they're like, you know what, you're not thinking big enough. We can actually do this. And you'd be like, wow, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that. If you're in this for the long haul, we can do that. But you won't get to that conversation unless you talk openly and honestly about what you need.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's one question in the Q&A, which I think you've just sort of addressed right now, but they ask, how would you see doing data collection or field work in an Indigenous or anti-racism conscious way? The obvious way seems to be inclusion in the work because they've learned so much from doing this, but what other ways are there? And so I think, Nick, you already answered some of that, but do you have any other tips or thoughts about this?
I'll just say one thing briefly, and then I'll pass it on to the other panelists. One thing is knowing how to respect and, where appropriate, participate in local protocols. So if you're going to be working on lands in Indigenous territories, there's protocols that go with doing that in a good way. You may not be the one that has to guide those protocols, but you may need to be willing to participate in them before you do things like counting plants or harvesting plants and animals as part of a research project and that sort of thing. So just when you said data collection, that's what kind of comes to mind for me. It's not just about figuring out a scientific protocol that makes sense within your field and makes sense for your questions. It's also about learning about the local protocols of the peoples that have the longest term connection to that place.
Robin or Katie, do you want to add anything to this?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I think the question, I've lost it now because it's answered. Oh, there it is. It was like, how would you see doing data collection or field work in an anti-racism conscious way or an Indigenous conscious way? And the obvious way seems to be inclusion of the communities in the work, but what are some other ways of doing that?
Okay, I think Nick did a great job, but I think it's worth like reiterating that there's no substitute for community engagement, and that like traditional knowledges or these knowledges are living in community. So you can't, extract knowledge or ideas or concepts from individuals or communities and then integrate them into a research or management project. Ongoing community engagement, leadership, and consent. Some tools, there's like the fair and care. Those are some, the principles of fair and care are a good one set of tools. But I think also what comes to mind, well, Nick talked a little bit about this, but some like traditional ecology type data collection activities, going out and collecting plant tree diameters or something. So when I did my field work, I hired a tribal member to go out there with me. So I was working with more community members, even though I'm a community member, but just as important as the protocol for the data collection, that hard ecology data collection, was the protocol where we were going and visiting forest communities that were some hadn't been, were managed by state or federal entities, going in and visiting these communities, these elder beings, and speaking to them, using Anishinaabe and saying their names in the language that maybe they hadn't heard in a long while, and offering tobacco, which is an Anishinaabe protocol, like Nick mentioned, but that was just as important as those other protocols. And maybe that's a little too far into the weeds for someone trying to work in a different community, but engaging community members, there's no substitute.
Yeah, the only little bit I'll add would be centering the land. The people are important, but the people are focused on the land. So if you focus the land in your research, then for me, it feels easier to approach, because then you have a similar understanding and goal with the people that you're working with, which is to preserve that like land connection.
Well, thank you so much for answering those questions. Another thing I was curious to know from all three of you is like, do you have any tips, for young Indigenous or non-Indigenous scientists who are interested in alternative methodologies on how to do science or indigenous science without having an identity crisis?
Good luck. The whole point of this journey, this academic journey, is to get you uncomfortable and push you. If you are always in the same space, you will never know what your boundaries are and what your values are. And when you feel pushed to the brink, that's when you know where your limits are at. Are there more healthy ways to explore those limits? Absolutely. I think that is what you want to do, is find healthy ways to explore your limits. There's a lot of things potentially that does not, adhere to your personal ethics, but you would need to know what your personal ethics are. There are practices that may go against your personal practices, but again, you would need to know what your practices are. I literally found out I was Hawaiian. This is hilarious. My first year in undergrad, which sounds ridiculous, but I knew I was Hawaiian by blood, but I didn't know I was Hawaiian culturally until the curriculum we were working on was based on Hawaiian knowledge. And I was the only person who knew the answers to most of the questions. And I was just, my mind was blown because I thought that these were really common things. And I'm an urban Hawaiian, so like I'm not out in the country, like I'm pretty connected to electricity. So the fact that I knew these things when I thought I didn't know anything about my culture really impacted me. So in undergrad, before I did my research, I was already having an identity crisis because I was leaning into who I actually was. Because I didn't know that, because I was always around other people who maybe knew those things. So we don't have to look at it as a negative if we try and take healthy steps towards literally learning who we are. When we have an identity crisis, we're questioning our ethics and our morals. And you really have to have some steel ethics and morals to be, I'm going to go with an above board scientist. There's a lot of scientists out there. Many of them are below board. And that means not following policies, not like, we're not even talking about racism here. We're just talking about science. So you want to be above board. You want to have high, not just high standards, but high quality of work that people can trust the numbers and, the statements that you're suggesting and your recommendations.
So the way that I avoid having an identity crisis in this work is I at no part of my identity or my how I would describe myself has to do with my profession, honestly. Like I don't, if I introduce myself, even in very academic circles, I don't say it's not just because I'm an interdisciplinarian, but I don't name a discipline as like fill in the blank of I am a. It just doesn't make sense to me, to say I am an ecologist, I am an anthropologist. I mean, that's not who I am. I mean, that's some things that I do, some things that I've learned about, but it has nothing to do with who I am, really. And so, I mean, I'm not overly focused on my personal identity. I'm focused on trying to be a part of a community. I'm not worried about any kind of professional legacy. And so that helps me not have an identity crisis. I'm not worried about all the, things that I'm transcribing through, papers, like lessons that I'm trying to get out there, or, promotions I'm trying to get or whatever. I'm just, at the end of this life, I want to be able to have, people look back and say he was a good man, he was a good husband, he was a good father, he was there for community, he was a good community member. Like those are things I care about. And, if I'm so lucky that, 5 generations or whatever down the line that somebody's looking at an old photograph of me, they'd be like, this guy was cool. Like, you should know about this guy. He was cool. Like, here's some of the things he was into. Here's some of the things that he supported. But I don't need for that conversation to be like, he was a professor of whatever, or he was a scholar of whatever. I don't care if people remember that. And so, If I get into that kind of orientation, then I don't feel like I'm being pulled in multiple directions. And I don't feel like I have an identity crisis. Work is what I do for a living. I have like some, I feel like I'm doing, trying to do work that matters, but it's not the most important thing in my life. And if I had to, for whatever reason, if I chose to, or had to do a complete career shift, it wouldn't cause me to have an identity crisis. You know, when I'm ready to retire, I'm not going to hang on to, you know, stick around as long as possible and try to stay involved in the campus or whatever, because it's just not a huge part of who I am. It's just kind of what I do right now. So yeah, and having that perspective is very freeing.
Well, I guess, okay, I've talked a little bit about the dissertation, and all along the way, there's been the struggle of, wow, I could put all this energy, all this time and commitment into, say, learning Anishinaabemowin, like learning my language. But instead, here I am digging into academia, you know, after already having a pretty good, fulfilling career. But I really believe that we need diverse perspectives in the systems that we have right now. You know, we need Indigenous women teaching ecology and forestry and all the different relationships that come along with that. And I'd point out that there's lots of sciences. You know, science is not just Western science. We have Anishinaabe and other sciences with our ways of learning about and moving in creation. And I think that's a strength that should be shared or is worth sharing. So, so for folks feeling like lost in a sea of Western scientific methodologies and priorities, I'd say, you know, focus on your teachings to stay grounded and use the tools and the platforms that you have to do your good work.
Thanks. Robin, you just mentioned that we need like more diverse perspectives and like more diverse women teaching in EEB. And I remember, Katie, when you were talking about how it was like one class which was teaching you about Hawaiian culture or ecology that sort of blew away your mind. And so that sort of relates to one of the questions in the Q&A, where they're asking that from the standpoint of teaching in an EEB department, how have you changed your courses to convey your priorities compared to the same topic that you learned as a student? If you are teaching any courses, or if you have, or if you are planning to in the future.
I'll jump in as hopefully I'll be teaching this fall, or I'm planning on teaching this fall, but in some like adjunct and other work. I center, like we have this so many different ways of knowing and being across the earth, and like that can enrich any subject or any field that you're working in. There are traditional knowledges that, you know, can inform or can guide curriculum in soil sciences and in forestry and everything. And I think that I also have and will center communication and that ability to observe, listen, watch, and learn from and with one another from diverse perspectives. I think that's a core thing that human beings are need to and keep working on, right?
I think I might be teaching this fall as well. And the curriculum I told you about that taught me that I was Hawaiian, like it didn't literally teach me that, but I'll probably be taking that whole curriculum with me. I'm like one of the last students of the ethnobotany program. And so that curriculum was written actually by a Native Hawaiian woman that impacted me. So that's the importance. And I never met her, and I've only heard about her. And actually somebody gifted me the original curriculum from like the 70s in like an old school binder from the 80s. So I have the original curriculum now, as well as the updated curriculum in the 2000s, and I'll probably update those curricula. But yeah, centering is, I think, the only way to do it. Like Robin said, there's no reason to shy away from it when it's kind of all I want to talk about. And I think what a lot of people are interested in.
Nick, do you have anything to add?
So I was just trying to get into the chat, into the Q&A, and I was typing some responses in there. I know we were talking about teaching, but could you just kind of tell me the specific question?
Yeah, so this question was, sorry, I have to look for it again. From the standpoint of teaching in an EEB department, how have you changed your courses to convey your priorities compared to the same topic that you learned as a student?
Yeah, I mean, I've never been, so I don't have, I was never really like squarely an EEB kind of contributor. And so my classes don't really feel like classes that you would take as an EEB student per se. But my teaching has shifted a lot over the years. And it's funny how, I don't know, this is going to help answer the question, but somebody might get something out of this anyways. So I'm one of these teachers that I never teach the same class twice. Like every time I teach a class, it's a new prep. Might have the same name, same course number, but I don't, by the time I finish that class, it's not that, yeah, sometimes I just don't like it anymore, or it just needs to be freshened up. Like the only way that I keep up with my reading is by assigning things in my classes. So I'm 90% of what I assign, I'm reading for the first time with my students. I'm kind of obsessed with assignments, like coming up with cool assignments that are super meaningful, fun, engaging, challenging, and not hard to grade. And so I'm always coming up with ideas for assignments. And so I come up with an idea. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's way better than what I did last year in this class. And so I swap it. So like every class is like new assignments, new readings. And so the only thing that doesn't change is the title or the overall sort of umbrella. And so my teaching is just always evolving. You know, what I do the most enjoy that is very much kind of connected to sort of EEB realm is field-based learning. So, I mean, as a student, like that's when I figured out that I actually like was an okay student or liked to learn, is like when I went to the University of Michigan, the first semester that I was there, taking like field-based classes where we were learning about plants and things. And it's like, man, just getting on my feet, getting outside and being interactive and touching and whatever, just all the sensories, not just listening and taking notes. And so I love teaching that way when I can, to get students out of the classroom, see things, meet with people, have conversations, be out in the woods, be out in wetlands. I still love to do that. It is, you know, a challenge where I work. The seasons are so weird. It's hard. Like if you look at our quarter system, there's except for in the summer, there's not a term where it's just like always good weather to be doing that kind of work. So that's a challenge, but I try to do that kind of teaching whenever I can.
Thanks.
Okay, so our next question is asking for some advice. We would like to know, what advice do you have for graduate students or early career scientists who are interested in incorporating racial or environmental justice into their work, especially when their work is more viewed as traditional EEB, and it might not be, say, supported by your department or institution?
I think getting in, yeah, I know we're all like waiting for the other guy to jump in. I love it. I love this game, guys. I think I'll just be real quick. I think political ecology is a really good caveat to getting into that. How I got into that part is I just worked for government in Congress at our county courthouse, getting in and actually doing it. So there's a lot of work. There's no shortage of it. So I think figuring out where you want to be ish, and then working around getting experience, hanging out with those people, getting access to those conversations is really your first step. And political ecology, I think, is a good, safe thing, but it'll get you down a rabbit hole real quick.
I think that we've shared a lot of things that apply to this question. If folks have been listening to the whole discussion, and things like just being willing to show up, like Katie said, and just participate, as opposed to showing up and saying, hey, I've got these research skills, I've got this idea, let's work together. Show up, participate, focus on that anti-racist work as a contributor. Through that, let people get to know you, be willing to share things about yourself, share things about your hopes, desires, skills, whatever. And then people will invite you to bring that, if it makes sense, invite you to bring that in. So I think that's part of it. Another thing that kind of comes to mind is I was listening to Kim Tallbear talk on a panel maybe last week or something like that. And she was talking about the importance of like just thinking hard about where you work. And this was a question that came up in the Q&A. I tried to type a quick response to as well. If you have, this question could be somebody that's already in a program. It's like, all right, I'm gonna be here for the next 5 years. How do I do this? But it also could be somebody who's trying to figure out where to go to grad school, or somebody that's wrapping up grad school and trying to think about where they want to work. If in academia, out of academia, what type of institution. And what Dr. Tallbear shared was that, like, she's like, don't trade like prestige for being able to be around the kind of people you want to be around, or being close to community, or so in other words, you might be able to sort of choose a graduate program or a work environment where your peers and your mentors and your colleagues or whatever are just like down for that kind of work. They recognize the value of that kind of work. They count that kind of work. And you're going to have a better time weaving that kind of work into your research program if it's respected, if it's understood, if it's recognized, if it's valued. And not all places do recognize or value that kind of work. So just knowing that, and so do you want to have to do, if you go into one of those places, you're either gonna have to do it as your like side thing and be, not have it be super forefront about what you're doing, or you're going to have it be super forefront of what you're doing and be constantly explaining to people why that's important. And that gets really tiring. So you can maybe, if you have control over it, try to work in an environment where that sort of work is valued and understood.
I don't know what else I could even add. I think Nick got to the heart of what I would recommend from my experience. Although when I think about traditional EEB, I think why isn't that, or for me, it's rooted in, so Gikinawabi, we have this in the Anishinaabe language, there's this term for this process where someone learns about creation, or listens, watches, and observes other beings in the world. And I feel like that's traditional EEB, I guess, or that jives for me. And so I don't have anything else to add, but good talk so far, Nick, or good description.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask a question. I think a lot about human genetics. And I know that our public institutions and private institutions like 23andMe and Ancestry, they're all desperate for Indigenous genomes because it makes their predictions better, and they can really, they benefit so much and will profit so much from this data. But I don't necessarily see, there's such an imbalance of who's benefiting from that data. And so I'm wondering if that's something you've ever encountered, and if you have any thoughts on kind of the proprietorship of that data, the ownership.
I mean, I'll just say, I don't know why anybody would ever volunteer their DNA to those databases. I don't know why you would ever do that. For me, I can't consider a moment where I would want these companies to have my whatever, my DNA, sort of building this network of understanding that they sell, when it's really kind of a misunderstanding. I mean, mostly my connection to those corporate projects is that they are used in ways that confuse what it means to be Indigenous. And so they just kind of create a mess of people's understanding of what it means to be an Indigenous person, or the roles of Indigenous nations in determining who is part of the community, who's not, who's part of the nation, who's not. They confuse our Indigenous understandings, pluralized understandings, because different places, but Indigenous understandings of kinship are just completely obfuscated by those projects. So yeah, so I'm extremely wary. I don't enjoy water cooler conversations about 23andMe stuff, and I mean, how many times a week I talk to somebody who wants to tell me about all the different ways that their genealogy kind of has been described in those data sets and how they're native or whatever. It's a weird space for me.
Same here. I don't have a great answer for that question.
Susanna, sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so I mentioned that I think a lot about human genetics and genome sequencing of humans, and there's so much emphasis on indigenous genomes. And I'm just curious if anyone has encountered that and your opinions on where that data goes, because it largely is taken away from our own communities.
I'm aware of an Indigenous data sovereignty initiative around DNA. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Keolu Fox's work. Okay, you're in the know then. That's what we know. And I think related to what Nick said, blood quantum, hilariously, was used originally to separate people from their lands. But it's really a power dynamic that we're talking about, because now it's being utilized in another sense, which is a little off-putting because we've been dealing with this other approach of blood quantum. So blood quantum inherently in DNA is political in itself. And I think we do have some Indigenous intelligentsia on that, and it sounds like you're looped into that conversation. So also there's a conversation going on in New Zealand. In 2018 they published a book about DNA. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. I have the book somewhere over here. So those are conversations happening, and it's like Nick says, that's an interesting conversation they have over there with the DNA, and that spills over into GMOs actually, which is another, my favorite word of the month is kerfuffle for some reason. So it's just a kerfuffle in itself. But yeah, I think I haven't taken a DNA test. My partner has, because their family is adopted, and they're really interested in getting to know who they are. And unfortunately, the essence of being a human is just figuring out who you are the whole time you're alive, which is a little maddening. But yeah, I guess that's my answer. It might not be as supportive. It seems like you're looped into the conversations that I am aware of, but DNA and blood quantum is a political, divisive conversation in my opinion. But the work that can be done from it could be fruitful if, ethically and morally engaged people are involved.
Yeah, and Susanna, I don't, just to clarify too, like I'm not anti-genetics research, just because you talked about the 23andMe, ancestry.com type space. That's the stuff that's icky to me. Also, any research that is, using human biological samples, like it's just very fraught territory, and including genetics work. So, people that are doing that work with Indigenous partners, about Indigenous partners, I think that it's so fraught that the only way to really do that is if the community is asking for that help and they have 100% control of the data. They 100% own the data. I mean, it's them. It's about their bodies. It's about their community. And so I think a lot of powerful work actually has happened and can happen. It's just got to be community controlled. And so that, that presents some limitations for researchers. You may or may not be able to be in a position where you can put a lot of time into something where another entity has full control over the data. But there's creative ways to work through that, and to make sure that the researcher's needs are met, but that data sovereignty is respected. So it can be navigated, but it is a long process. And the less well known you are in a community, the longer that process is going to be in terms of like the front end work that needs to happen to even before you can start doing any kind of, collecting any samples or whatever. So it's yeah, but it's not that I'm against genetics work at all. It's, of course, I want to hear more about your work.
Yeah, thank you. I did understand what you mean. I'm also like, my genome is me and no one else can have it. If it's going to be sequenced, I'm going to sequence it. Yeah, and I was really influenced by Dr. Fox's work. So yeah, thank you all for bringing that up.
Okay, so our next question is there general agreement in your institution that science and intellectual activity in general cannot be apolitical?
Not in mine. Yeah, I think that's an ongoing sort of discourse where I work, and kind of like all the academic institutions that I'm connected to in different ways. There's still plenty of people who think that that the work that they do is very specifically and consciously apolitical. And so those conversations are ongoing, and I try to work to get people to think in different ways. So just recognize that there's always political implications of your work. And then you got to sit down and break down everything that they're doing and kind of talk about that. And usually people can kind of see it. But I don't think, we're not anywhere close to where even a place where like most of the people I work with kind of say, yeah, there's political ramifications to everything we're doing. My work is political, intentionally or unintentionally, so we're not there yet.
Can't really speak on behalf of the whole university, but yeah, that discourse is happening as well. I did just learn a few months ago that DBH, diameter at breast height, which is a really common forest inventory metric, that's the breast height of Gifford Pinchot, and who was, I don't know, there's a paper that just came out about it, but just what a great example of the socio-political history and social construction of such a popular measurement.
I think in our nonprofit, that's the work, but I'm not sure if people understand like the larger ramifications of the work. So I am clear about that. I'm aware, and that's the plane that I work on. But people work on different planes, and I think that it's really important to give people that room to work on different planes. And that's where they're at. That's the work that they want to do. When I hear work is political, I literally think policy. Like I automatically go to policy, not just, running in the streets or signing a change.org petition. Like I don't look at that as political. I look at that as civic engagement now. actual politics is creating policy, implementing policy, appropriating funds to policy. It's very more precision for me. But the inside outside dynamics of policy itself is really interdependent on each other. You just can't have politicians doing things and you just can't have people yelling on the outside. It's really a cohesive, interwoven relationship. And when you add Indigenous politics on that, it's just a whole nother game. It's literally a whole nother game that you need to learn, especially the cultural parts. And a lot of those things we don't talk about, they're just very inherent. So I think kind of where Nick and Robin are is where our organization is, even though our nonprofit is the legacy of the first Native Hawaiian congressman for the state. So it's a little different in our nonprofit, but I'm not really trying to push. I'm trying to push myself. I'll put that. I'm trying to push myself to be more understanding that people don't understand that the process that they're engaged in is political inherently. And the only way to get out of that is to change your job.
What about at U of M EEB? Does that department feel like a community of people that recognize all work is inherently political or something different?
Are you talking about University of Michigan
Oh,
Ecology?
sorry. Yeah. So I was asking the grad students, what's it like at University of Michigan EEB?
That's a good question. I think that a lot of us do. And then maybe there are some that don't. I'll just say that much.
Yeah, we do have allies within the faculty and of course within our graduate student body. But I couldn't say that it spreads everywhere, but we certainly do have a conscious faculty that I think will value from a lot of the things that we've talked about in our symposium.
Yes, I completely agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely benefit from spending more time thinking about this. And, but my perspective is that we live in a world that has a lot of power imbalances and a lot of injustices. And so we're involved in all that in one way or another. We have sort of positionality in those power dynamics, and our work is either influenced by those dynamics in terms of determining the questions we ask or the funding that we have access to because of the way we write up our work or whatever. There's politics involved in all that. There's power dynamics involved in all that. And then if you do work in other people's lands, or if you do work with other people's DNA or knowledges or whatever, again, there's always power dynamics. There's always politics involved in that. And so even if a lot of times it's like there's a lot of people where I work that work in in the Arctic, and a lot of that work, not all of it, but a lot of that work is sort of fly in, fly out, and trying to stay, not really thinking about the politics of that, not thinking of the politics of the coming and going and your presence there, not thinking of the politics or the potential implications to justice issues and power imbalances of the ways that your work is mobilized and leveraged and influencing policy decisions and things. And it's not always as clear, depending on what you do, like what the political connections are, but they're there, in my opinion. In some instances more. And the thing that I have a hard time with is when it's pretty obvious. It's like your work is going to influence policy. This work's going to influence policy, and that policy is going to potentially be forced down Indigenous people's throats. Like it's going to be a policy that they have to respond to, that they don't get to write. And your work's a part of that. And so how can you say it's apolitical? Because you're influencing in one way, maybe a small way, it might just be a drop in the bucket, but you're influencing options for people potentially. by the ways that policymakers interpret your work.
Should we move on to the next question?
Sure, yeah. We have a few minutes. So how do we ensure that everyone, academic and non-academic, has a voice in the conversation about how to make science more inclusive?
I'll jump in there and kind of piggybacking off of what Nick was just talking about with who is everybody? Do we even know who everybody is, who should be at the table or who should have a voice? I think we still, generally speaking, there's a lot to learn. And I think that all this, what we've been talking about, community engagement, actually working with people, developing real, true, trusting relationships, that's what's required in order to discover who should have a voice, or whose voices we should be creating space for or ensuring that there's space for. And then in connecting with them. And then I think it's more about building the opportunity to co-create inclusivity versus me including you in my space and you including me in yours. Just there again, it just takes commitment, time, true relationship building.
One of the questions in our community forest group that used to always come up, thank goodness it stopped, is who is the community, which is relevant to your question, and who is the community will impact like what happens with this project if it's the intention was for it to be Native Hawaiian lineal descendant led. And I was like, okay, if that's the intention, then who's the community? And if the community is Native Hawaiian lineal descendants, then it's pretty clear who we're going to engage. And people who are not Native Hawaiian lineal descendants were like, well, this is going to be a problem because X, Y, and Z. But then related to the land that we're working on, which is called an experimental forest, looking at the policy, I identified that it doesn't matter who we engage as the community, because within this experimental tropical forest area, we're running an experiment which centers Native Hawaiian lineal descendant ways of being and knowing. And if that's our project, then that's what we're doing. So I had to be really staunch about that. The person kept talking about it 5 times. It'd been 2 years, 3 years. So not getting the message. And so when people do that, I view it as antagonistic because you had a question, we answered it multiple times, and yet still here you are not listening. And so I look at it also as an act of violence because I'm telling you where the boundary is, not just my boundary, but through the policy and the politics of that land and those landowners. And therefore I'm separated from this decision and this recommendation I'm giving to you. But because I'm Native Hawaiian, I must be biased. So just, walk lightly when you do these things. And I was just talking, I forgot about the question, so sorry. But it sounded really great up until that point, and I just lost what the question was in my head, so forgive me. But community, yes, got it, I got it back. But yeah, so who is the community? Do you view yourself as part of that community? When I think of community, I think of people who have a common objective and goal, or a common groundwork of perspectives, a nation perhaps. And so, what is the extent of the community? And I also look at that somewhat as a threatening question, because it's like, are you threatening me that I don't know who the community is, or I'm not engaging your community? I'm not engaging people that you see as part of your community. So you're telling me that the community that I am engaging in is not the community, but is specifically the target that we're going for. So you can see how that can flip around a lot. So just be very clear about who community is. And I'm trying to lean towards place-based. So it's clear, like, if you don't live in this place, then you're not based here, neither are your practices. And it isn't that we're not interested, it's just that we want to learn from those people who are connected to place. Soapbox off.
The other thing that I was thinking about when you raised this question of kind of how to get everybody in the conversation, two things come to mind. One is that I think we need to try to flatten out some of these hierarchical relationships. And, you know, if we value everybody as having like something to contribute, you know, everybody knows something, everybody can contribute something. One of us isn't smarter than the other, you know, the full professor is not smarter than the grad student or whatever. Just sort of humbling ourselves in our understanding of what knowledge is and what counts as knowledge, recognizing that the knowledge that's held by more than humans is just as important as the knowledge held by humans, that the knowledge held by faculty is no more important as knowledge held by staff, things like that. Just sort of leveling out that conversation will put you in a position where you can see who's not there, you know, because if it's a bunch of whatever, like silverback full prof sitting around saying, how are we going to figure this out? Who needs to be in this conversation? Yep. Okay. We're all here. All right, let's move forward. So I think that's, for me, that's part of the process. And I think also that Indigenous perspectives about relationships, bringing a lot of understandings of familial relationships into spaces that non-Indigenous people wouldn't recognize as family type relationships can be helpful in that regard. So in other words, it's not that, you know, as a you know, pushing 50-year-old academic that I shouldn't revere people that have been at it for a lot longer than me, you know, as elders or whatever. But it, you know, it's that those, you know, whatever, the people that are kind of my junior in academic parlance, like I don't want to think of myself as more important than them. And, you know, like if we think of it as like, you know, more like siblings, you know, older sibling, younger sibling, or like some of these relationships as more like niece, nephew, aunt, uncle type thing, then you want to be more inclusive, right? So like a good auntie is going to not just like take up all the air in the room, like she's going to bring the nieces and nephews into the conversation. And so I think, you know, not that universities need to like adopt Indigenous kind of ways of understanding sort of familial relationships, but there is something to be learned by just thinking about that, you know, by just kind of considering that type of an approach. And then the other thing that comes to mind is just like, instead of thinking about how do we include everybody, or not instead of, but as well as that, thinking about like, what's my role in this conversation? What's my responsibility in this conversation? I think is just something that's a step that we oftentimes skip. You start to articulate what your responsibilities are and what your roles are, then it helps you also to see like where the missing pieces are.
Well, I think we are nearly out of time, or we're actually out of time. So I wanted to thank you all for engaging with us in this amazing discussion that we've had today. I think that, you know, everything that you've said has given us a lot to think and reflect about, because I believe that your advice is useful and important for people doing research, not only in Indigenous communities, but everywhere else in the world. And, you know, it makes us question and analyze our own ways of doing science and its role in society today. So thank you so much to our guest speakers for gracing us with your presence. I would also like to thank everybody in the audience for joining us today. And then finally, on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to thank our generous sponsors, the Center for Education of Women through their Irma Wyman Fund and the Rackham Grad School through their Faculty Allies grant for sponsoring this year's symposium. I hope you've enjoyed the whole symposium, and we look forward to seeing you again next year with a new topic for the Early Career Scientist Symposium. Everyone have a wonderful weekend, as I'm sure I will. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Chimigwich.